say it's alright. Sweet darling, it's been a
Easter dog. All right. Thank you, Milton. Yeah, it's perfect. You're getting really good at this. All right. Okay, welcome, macro class. This is our continuation. Hope everybody is doing well. Hope you all had a nice Easter and everybody's well and taking precautions and staying healthy, and we're getting through this day at a time, but we're getting through it. Okay, so now we're going to be going into growth theory. You know, why do some countries grow, some countries don't? What makes it up? We will be doing, covering the 2 chapters on that. Then we will, on Wednesday, we will be talking about the Great Recession, the Great Depression, different economic philosophies, so on and so forth. And we also will be talking about aggregates, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run, long run. Those 2 chapters will pretty much finish our segment. And then we will open, the test will be open Friday evening. But we're going to cover growth theory. I sent you the old notes, so you should have them. If you want, I can send you all the notes that are on this board as well. All right, okay. If it's hard to read, so I'll shoot you these as well. Okay. All right. So when we're talking about economic growth, well, specifically, when we talk about economic growth, it's the percent change in the nominal GDP. Remember, nominal in current dollars. We say, okay, what's the percent change? You know, what did it move to? Then, as we've done before, we have to squeeze out the inflation. So we take out the percent change of inflation, we take that out. Then we also have to take out the percent change in the population, because if you've had a huge population increase, well, that can affect your economic growth, especially in terms of real GDP per capita. So we take out the inflation rate, growth, we take out the population growth, and then from that finally gives us economic growth, okay? And what we're talking about today. When we talk about economic growth, they bring up that rule of 70, which actually is not a bad rule for you to keep in mind, you know, even after this class is gone. It's an interesting rule. It tells you how long it's going to take you to double your money on an investment. Well, in your case, it would be on an investment. So if you were buying bonds, long-term bonds at 2%, all you do is you take whatever interest rate you're going to get and you divide it into 70, and that will tell you how many years it's going to take you to double your money. In this case, it's 35. Now, in the good old days, back in the late 70s, early 80s, of course, inflation was running rampant, and we had a prime rate of over 20%, so I don't know if they were such great days, but you were easily able to get 10, 11% on your money, easily. So I was always thinking in terms of doubling money in 6 to 7 years. Okay, but you got to remember those are the days where we were getting 10, 11%. But that's a good rule to remember, and it's really simple. The rule of 70. Whenever you're investing in any kind of a stock or a bond, and they're saying you're going to get this kind of return, whatever that return is, divide it into 70, and that will give you the number of years it's going to take you to double your money. And all of you are young, so this rule would be important to you. it's not quite as important to me. All right. But we will use this rule of 70 when we say, well, what happened to one country as opposed to another? For instance, if a country, if they actually grew by 2%, year after year, is that significant? And yes, it is significant, because that would mean in 35 years, they would have doubled. They would have doubled their economic growth. And as we can see, when in our textbook, they talk about the years 1960 to the year 2010. And was there a significant difference? Yeah, there was. We grew at on an average of around 2%, which may not sound like a lot, but year after year, you do that for 50 years, and you're going to have some surprising results. Now, I know in your book they showed you that Impala. Well, a 1960 Impala with nothing in terms of options. No power brakes, no power steering, no radio. If you didn't buy the radio as an option, you got a metal plate in the dashboard, which wasn't all that attractive. Anyway, so in 1960, Chevy Impala was around $2,600. And the median income in 1960 was about $2,880. So looking at it that way, it took a person almost an entire year's worth of salary to buy a car. And in 1960, we thought the Impala was pretty cool, although the engine wasn't as fuel efficient, didn't have any of the safety features that it has now. Engine certainly wasn't as powerful. No power steering, no power brakes, no power windows. You actually had to crank the windows up. Oh my gosh, my kids wouldn't know how to operate the windows. I'm just kidding. And it didn't have any of the features that the cars have now. And they compare it to a 2010 Camry. Well, the Camry has everything. It's got a great sound system, power steering, power windows, power brakes, great fuel economy, more powerful, safer. And, well, what did it cost? Well, naturally the prices went up, but so did everything else. So when we compare and we say, all right, well, this Camry costs around $26,600. Well, we take the median family income, and that's $5,500 in 2010. So in 2010, it's going to take you approximately 6 months to purchase a vehicle that's far superior to the one in 1960. Okay? So in terms of economic growth, 2% over that 50 years made a big difference. They also showed TVs. I remember the console, the big wood console TVs, great. They took up a quarter of the room. And black and white and only 4 channels. Well, the one in your book, it was around, $575? So that was a big chunk of your money if you're only making $2,600 or $2,800. That was a big chunk of your income. But now in 2010, they show you a 50-inch for $500. Look, it's costing you much less percentage-wise of your income, and the product is, infinitely superior. Okay? All right. So getting back to the fact, a small percent, remember percent, and the triangle, the delta, that's change. Small percent change can make a big difference. We talk about different countries. Haiti, Zimbabwe, little or no economic growth. They're still struggling 50 years later. And none of us, I don't think any of us, like to see anybody poor or hungry and bad, bad roads, bad health system, poor education. It seems such a pity that this could be avoided. Some countries like Turkey, they had about 2% increase. They were doing pretty darn well. And then there were some countries that really took off like South Korea, right? Now also, we talk about a little bit when we talk about goods, India and China, they invested over the recent, especially the last 10 years, especially in capital goods, which, remember from our class, you can't use capital goods right away. It's not like a consumer good, but it's something for future production, and that will make your economy grow even faster. So those economies are growing, even though their populations are huge. All right? All right, so what makes up this economic growth? Well, we have our resources. Remember, basic resources: land, labor, and capital. All right, well, land is pretty well fixed, but it's interesting. Land doesn't necessarily make the country rich, because, an example again from our book, Zimbabwe. They have rich natural resources in that country, and they're so poor. Those poor folks, I mean, they are really poor. Then you take a country like Japan, with hardly any natural resources, and they were, they were a powerhouse of industry. I mean, they took a huge percent of the automotive market from the big three, and on an island with hardly any natural resources. So anyway, but land in general, it's better to have natural resources than not. Okay, so land, what just God put in the earth for us. Okay. Labor. Now, we talk about labor. Remember, there's two kinds. There's the actual physical labor that we do. And then there's what is called human capital. And we break that down in a couple of ways. Human capital can be just the education of your workforce, or it could be the skill sets of your workforce. There's many applications to human capital. It's just how good, how productive your capital is going to be. And remember, in the book that I'm sure you all read, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, remember what, at the very end of the book, he finally tells you, what is the wealth of nations? It's labor productivity. It's you, it's me, it's our productivity, okay? So labor productivity, that is the wealth of nations. Okay? All right. Capital. Well, capital can be a lot of things. Could be a machining center. Could be a roadway. Could be the shipping containers, which in your book talked about, what a big difference that made in loading and unloading ships. It could be all sorts of machinery, or it could be something as complicated as a big machining center, or just something simple, making a hammer with a rubber handle that just makes it easier to use. All those things help. Okay. Technology, that's always a biggie. Okay. Technology, basically, you can make more with your current assets. Okay. Or if you don't have as much, you can make as much as you were before with less assets. Pretty much breaking it down that way. But technology is putting the knowledge, putting the skill set, putting it to use. And that's, I think the American economy does that very, very well. They put that knowledge to good use. Okay? Institutions. Now, institutions, I can't stress this enough. There was a famous economist, Hernando de Soto, and he had a team that they went all through various countries. He was in Peru for quite a while, and they were trying to study, why in the heck are these people so poor? And when they finally came, the long and the short of it is because they don't have any property rights. You didn't know if the land you were cultivating if you were going to keep the crops, or if someone was going to come over and say, "Oh, sorry, the government said I could have half of that, or it's not yours," or even if the government wasn't involved, there was no government to protect your property rights. We don't appreciate property rights as much in this country. We take it for granted because we never think twice about it. When you buy something, it's yours because we have a strong government that will absolutely protect your property rights. That is key. I know it's hard for us to get our mind around the fact living in an area that property rights are not strictly enforced. But when they're not, you lose all incentive to produce. Okay? So property rights, of institutions, property rights, I started. That is one of the key. All right? A little side story is the Soviet Union. They knew something was up. Their people were starving to death. So what did they allowed, which strictly speaking wasn't supposed to be allowed. In the Soviet Union, they allowed Soviet garden plots. All right, and what that meant was if you had a little scrub of land behind your little house, they say, okay, you've got a little area, you can grow it, and whatever you grow on that, you get to keep. Okay, so you go off to the big collective farm and work the farm, but then when you came home, you could work your own just tiny little area. And this is unbelievable fact. But these Soviet garden plots constituted less than half of 1% of the farmland in the Soviet Union. Less than half of 1%, okay? And yet they produced 27% of the agricultural product of the Soviet Union. If it wasn't for these Soviet garden plots, there would have been even more millions and millions of people starving to death in the Soviet Union. All right, so we also have good, stable government, markets, competitive, open markets. Okay, we saw the free workings between supply and demand, like that. International trade. International trade generally is a good thing. It will lead to economic growth. And international flow of funds. If someone wants to come in and invest in our country, that's a good thing. Why? Because it keeps that pool, the borrowing funds, that keeps that pool of money sizable. For instance, if we had a rough year and folks weren't saving quite as much as they might have. And again, I'm talking about normal times. I'm not talking about what we're going through right now. But let's say we just didn't save quite as much as we might have. Well, foreign investors coming into our country, buying the debt, creates a nice size savings pool that keeps our interest rates down. So we like to have that flow of funds coming in, a free flow of funds coming in and out, and vice versa. If we saw a good opportunity overseas, that we could take advantage of it, or a corporation could. All right? Efficient taxes, we may have touched on that. Remember, taxes, obviously the government needs some money just to provide all the things that aren't efficiently produced by the private sector. But we don't want them to have too much in terms of taxes because it kills incentives. Okay, so efficient, somewhere in between the two is an efficient tax rate. All right, stable money and prices. Well, naturally, if you're experiencing high inflation, or God forbid, hyperinflation, and your money is becoming worth less and less and less, and prices are going all over the place, well, that does not lead to good economic growth. You know, people aren't, domestically, you're not going to know what's a good investment and what's not. Whether I should invest in this piece of property or this or that asset, is it going to keep up with inflation? Is it not going to? And moreover, foreigners, when they see runaway inflation, they're certainly going to shy away from a country that's experiencing that. So we like to see nice, stable money and prices. Matter of fact, that's what we talk about. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. This is macroeconomics, remember. It's the big picture, right? Gross domestic product, inflation, unemployment. Inflation, unemployment, those are the two evils. And the objective for you macroeconomists is what we talked about, I believe, before everything went online, was a nice, smoothing out the peaks and the valleys of growth. Nice, smooth growth without huge peaks of inflation or troughs of severe recessions. That's what our growth is. Okay, so when we look at growth, we go back to the time of Jesus Christ, which I thought was actually kind of timely since yesterday was Easter, and it is in your book, so I guess I'm allowed to say it. In the time of Jesus Christ, to almost the 1700s, people were just barely making a living, and it didn't change. In fact, there was, if you study it close enough, there was a little dip in the Dark Ages. But for so long, for 1750 years, we've got a subsistence level of income. People are starving to death. What happened? Well, what happened was nothing happened. They had hardly any economic growth. But then machinery came into the picture. They started using machines to replace labor. And when that happened, it started what they call the Industrial Revolution, which began in England, but it quickly spread to the United States and France and many other countries, okay? And we see that from late 1700s, early 1800s on, that real GDP, it just skyrocketed. And we are, today that's where we're at now. Okay, so let's take a look at early growth theory. Now, again, a lot of times, just like when we're going to talk about, in the Great Depression, when the Great Depression hit, they didn't have macroeconomics at all. It was all microeconomics, okay? Well, even in the after the war, 1940s or so, there wasn't really a well-defined school of growth theory. Robert Solow in the early 1950s, he was probably one of the early ones who came up with growth theory for an economy. Now, what he did, he took the production function, which we have talked about, and my micro students already know from last semester, and it's capital, basically the inputs of capital and labor. Output is some function of capital and labor. All right, now this is a rather micro concept, all right? It's what the business puts in, capital, labor, and to get output, okay? So Solow took it and he builds on it, and he does add resources. So we've got physical capital, labor, human capital, and resources, okay? But he really, really, really concentrates on physical capital, okay? So he said output is just a function of physical capital, human capital, and resources. Now, they say, okay, but what about technology? What about technology? Well, for technology, Solow says, okay, I'm not going to discount it completely, but technology was considered exogenous. And remember, we talked about very early probably one of the first weeks, outside of the model. Exo would mean outside, and then endogenous was inside the model. It was considered, technology was considered somewhat on the outside of this growth model. It was, yeah, it added to it. It added to it, don't get me wrong. But it was something that came in from the outside. And many times, Solo would say it's just pure luck. Well, in modern growth theory, they did more of a study on it, and technology isn't on the outside. Sometimes it is. In your book, they use Post-it notes as an example. Now, that was a kind of an interesting, kind of a funny example. The scientists, they were working on this, what they thought was going to be a super glue, super adhesive. And they had applied it to paper and things, and I guess as the story goes from what I recall, they left for the weekend, they came back, and they thought, oh, it was going to be just terrific, and they looked at it, and they could just pull it off very easily. So they thought it was a complete failure, but it wasn't. Turned out there was a great application for it. So now that would be luck, okay? But for the most part, technology comes from you, and comes from me, comes from us. You know, we are in the system. We are part of growth theory. And this technology, it's not on the outside. It is down the inside, okay? Anyway, getting back to Solo, he concentrated again on physical capital. And remember our marginal product of capital, marginal always means additional, one more. Well, marginal, when you talk about marginal product of capital, you say, hey, how much did our output change when we added one more unit of input, or in this case, one more unit of capital? What did our output change? With that, we have to remember also our law of diminishing marginal returns, or diminishing marginal product. And again, you already know this. It just means that as I'm adding one more and one more and one more, the bang for my buck is getting smaller and smaller. So the return, as I'm adding one more and one more and one more, keeps getting smaller, okay? So he takes these two thoughts and he says, all right, well, let's look at it. He said, now we know that investment will drive output, okay? And that, that makes sense. But what he goes a little bit further, he says, yes, but what we have to do is we have to consider depreciation. Now, depreciation is as your asset gets used up and its useful life is diminishing. You have to factor that in. If you were in business, accountants like to take accelerated depreciation for tax purposes. But regardless, in real life, your equipment, whatever it is, your asset, it's going to have a useful life. It's going to lose a little bit of its useful life, over time. And that's depreciation. Well, if we combine the concept of diminishing returns with depreciation, now remember, when we're investing, if we just invest what was depreciated, and for instance, if you had 100 machine centers in your business, and 2 of them had just had it, you had them for a long time, and you invested and you got 2 more. Well, all right, your net investment would be 0 because you just replaced what was fully depreciated. When we do that, when we just replace what is fully depreciated, we have a net investment of 0, okay? All right, so here's what Solo says. He says, okay, well, yeah, okay, we'll give you something on technology, but the main thing is depreciation, and depreciation keeps going up and up and up. Now, we've talked about this before, you get that beginning, you get that fast rise, okay? Investments bring that fast rise of output. Then it starts to taper off because of diminishing returns. But here's where Solow tells us we're going to hit a state that we're going to stop investing. When that depreciation schedule hits investment, when depreciation equals investment, there's not going to be any more new investment. And we're going to go into what he calls the steady state. Now, when I was a student, and the first time I heard of that, I thought, holy smokes, steady state, that was the most depressing thing I read. I thought, I've got my whole life ahead of me, we're talking about heading into a steady state. And if I were you, I mean, all of you, you've got your whole careers ahead of you. You don't want to hear about the economy, we're going into a steady state. For God's sakes. Anyway, don't panic, because what the steady state, now, in a sense, if you concentrated strictly on physical capital and depreciation of physical capital and what it will do, and when the investment and the depreciation hit, so there's no more reason to invest, you could say, okay, yeah, I can see where there'd be a steady state. Okay, and following that, he said, well, and guess what? After all, these countries that have been growing like mad, they're going to start slowing down, they're going to hit that steady state, and guess what? All the poor countries around the world, they're going to start being in this area here. This super fast growth area. And you know what? They're going to converge with all the wealthy nations of the world. I don't know about you, but in the last 50 years, have you seen a lot of poor nations converging with the wealthy nations? No, I don't think so. We haven't had convergence theory. We've had divergence theory, if anything, unfortunately. I wish the poor nations, because none of us want to see countries and people poor and starving. But there hasn't been convergence, even when we've invested millions and billions in some places of dollars in projects in certain countries. Nothing happened. Why? It goes back to institutions. Governments were corrupt, siphoned off the money. They put up, look at the dam in Guyana. That's a perfect example. They built the dam. What happened? Nothing really. There wasn't an explosion of, now we got all this hydroelectric energy and we can really go to town and build a city and all. No, that didn't happen. All right? So we have to make sure in our equation for economic growth, we have to make sure that we include technology as an integral part of our economy. It's not just, yes, there are occasions where we just get dumb luck and we fall into something that, hey, that's great, and that's outside, okay. But technology is driven by you and by the institutions that allow you to use your experience, to use your brain, to use your skills, to develop more and better things. And the future is going to be so bright. I mean, I can't even imagine all the things that you folks are going to come up with. So anyway, we have to remember two things we have to add to the Solow model. And again, this is not a criticism of Solow, because in 1950 there wasn't much thought on growth theory. And also remember, whenever you look back and you're critiquing someone or something, as I say, hindsight is always 20/20. So This is not a criticism, but it is an augmentation of his theory, okay? And so we add to his theory, we add the importance of technology coming from within, and very important, I know I got it written down very small. Oh, the Easter bunny had a big day yesterday. Both bunnies, I think they slept till noon today. They had a big day yesterday. Institutions. So we have to stress the importance of institutions and the importance of technology. And as you see, when we add new technology, coming from within, not a fluke, not just dumb luck, and we add all the benefits of institutions for our economy, for our growth, look what happens to our curve. It just keeps going up and up and up. Okay? So we don't have convergence, we have divergence. And the thing we should take away from that is Solow was an early pioneer of growth theory, and what we have done is we've just added to it. We've added a little twist on technology and the great importance of institutions. Okay? All right. Next video will be on aggregates. That means all summed together. Aggregates and aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run and long run. It's actually it's fun and it's interesting. And then we'll finish off the lecture with the Great Recession, Great Depression, and the different economic philosophies. Remember what I said the very first week. This is economics. You know, sometimes there's not always a definitive answer. All right? Okay, everybody take care of yourself, and I'll see you in a couple days. All right? Okay.